Hey guys, this is Art Appreciation Online with Mrs. Specht. Today we are going to be learning about a new principle of design, one that you have probably been able to pick out and probably been able to talk about on your own because it's a word that you know in other contexts and you've used it before. But just for formality reason, let's go ahead and go through and learn about it. Today's principle of design is called contrast. As I said, this is one that you've probably been able to pick out. You've probably looked at artworks and said, okay, there's a contrast here in the red and the blue, or a contrast in the dark areas and the light areas. So we'll just kind of put it in perspective a little bit more and talk about why artists use that contrast. For the most part, contrast is usually used to make one area of the artwork stand out more than the rest. Many times artists do this to help the viewer figure out exactly what the artwork means, what the message is that they are trying to portray. It just kind of helps to highlight the most important areas of the picture so that it's a little bit easier for you to really navigate your way through. For the purposes of this class, I want you guys to remember 3 ways that an artist can create contrast. There are many different ways, but these are the 3 we're going to talk about in this podcast, and the 3 that I want you to remember should it come up on any quizzes or tests. Those 3 ways are through the use of color, value, or texture. Let's look at a few examples. Let's start out with value. Remember that value is the lightness or darkness of an object. Sometimes artists use the lightest area of the picture, contrasting with darker areas to create that point of emphasis and to kind of highlight one area. Sometimes they do the opposite. So let's look at 2 examples of that. Here we have a photograph of the same woman, but they're kind of in opposite values, if you will. The artwork on the left is using the lightest area of the picture, highlighting her face, and letting that contrast with the blackness of the background around her to create that emphasis, to highlight the part of the area that the artist wants us to remember after we have viewed the artwork. And the artwork to the right, he's done the exact opposite. In this case, he has created this silhouette effect of her face and her hair and her neck and the upper part of her shoulders, adding just a little bit of detail on the face, but for the most part just giving us this black silhouette, letting that contrast with this lighter area behind her, and that is how the artist is creating that emphasis and is highlighting and giving more importance to one area of the artwork than he is the other. So it could kind of go either way. You can't always say that the lightest area of the picture is going to be the point of emphasis, and you can't always say that the darkest area is going to be the point of emphasis. It just kind of depends. You'll hear me use the word emphasis a lot throughout this podcast. You will be reading about and learning about emphasis as another principle of design later on, but because the 2 go hand in hand, it's kind of hard to talk about one without talking about the other. Emphasis will come a little bit later, but you can at least get an idea of what it is and how it's created through contrast with this podcast. Here's another example of contrast in value. In this particular artwork, the artist wanted to make sure that the only thing we focus on and the only thing we really digest is the actual human figure that we see here. And by highlighting that, making that the lightest area of the picture and blacking out everything else in the background, we really have an easy idea of what we're supposed to be looking at and what we're supposed to be appreciating. Using that lightest value gives the skin tone this really kind of milky, sexy look to it, and using that high contrast also helps to define the musculature in the back and in the shoulder and in the arm. Color is another way to create emphasis, one that you'll see pretty often, or to create contrast rather, and emphasis. Here's an example of using color to create contrast in an artwork. Most of the time when you see a black and white artwork, it doesn't capture your attention as much and doesn't stop you in your tracks as easily as an artwork that has color. So in this particular artwork, you can see that the artist has selectively used the color red in this area as well as in the pupils of the eyes. and that is used to capture your attention. That really high contrast between the bright red and then the plain old black and white everywhere else in the picture stops you in your tracks. It makes you want to figure out what it's all about, and the red color is what you'll remember afterwards. After you leave the gallery, after you've seen this artwork online, you'll still be thinking about that red color. You'll still be thinking about why these little figures, these little minion characters are red. You'll be thinking about why his eyes are red. You'll be trying to figure out whether this red color is trying to represent love, passion, anger, blood, hatred. What is the color red representing here? And that will lead you ultimately to your interpretation of what the artist was trying to say. Here's another example of contrast in color. This is a painting by an artist named Mark Rothko. If you've ever done any art sightseeing in Houston, you may have been to the Rothko Chapel. If so, you saw some of his paintings up close and personal. This is another one. Here, this is a prime example of contrast in color because we have nothing else to look at here except for the colors. And in this particular case, Rothko decided to make the entire background as well as the bottom two-thirds of the painting these really deep, rusty, reddish orange colors, and then created this one swatch of paint at the top that is a lighter, kind of muted yellowish brown white color, and that is where our eye seems to linger. Since this is a non-objective artwork, there's not really much for us to digest as far as an interpretation and a message and a meaning. This is more of just something that is meant to be visually pleasing and almost like a cathartic thing to look at. So in that case, we take in everything, but because there's so much of this red color, we can take it in 1 second, and then our eye is drawn up here to this lighter area, and we spend a little bit more time looking at it and trying to figure out why it's at the top, why that color. That's just kind of where your eye sits and stays and seems a little bit more easy to you because the red can be overwhelming. So that's why he created this contrast of colors so your eye has somewhere to rest. Texture is the last way that I want you guys to remember and learn that an artist creates contrast in an artwork. You'll see this a lot in photography. Some people have kind of given photography a bad name. Throughout its history, a lot of people have not wanted to consider it a true art form because they felt like anything you could photograph, you could also paint or draw, and that it takes more skill to paint or draw something than it does to photograph it. However, if you're someone who really loves texture, and texture is something that you're really drawn to, photography is probably a medium that you're going to really enjoy because it's a whole lot more accurate when you capture textures with photography than when you try to recreate it with a painting or drawing. Certainly not impossible, but you'll see texture as the main focus of a lot of photographs as well as a lot of sculptures. Here we have a photograph, and all we have to look at here, all we have to take in, all we have to digest is the texture, the contrast in textures that we see here, as well as the shapes that are created by these objects that we're looking at. So here we have the contrast between this really smooth texture of the metal. Even though we've got some little imperfections, we've got some dirt and grime on top of the little metal crate, or metal grate rather, that we see here. Still, for the most part, these metal pieces, even as they blur out and recede towards the background, create really smooth, big, flat areas of color. And then in between each of those shapes, we have this much chunkier, discolored, uneven texture of the dirt and the rocks and even a little bit of grass that's growing up in between it. And that contrast in texture is one of the things that you will remember after you have viewed this artwork, in addition to the shapes that are created by the positive space, which are each one of these little metal pieces, and then the negative space that's created by the dirt in between each of those little spaces. So in this photograph, those are the only two things we have to look at. That's how we know that texture and shape are the main characters that the artist really wanted us to focus on. As I said, sculpture is also another medium that uses contrast and texture a lot, or just uses texture a lot in general. Here we have a really kind of cool, funky sculpture. Once again, you could call this non-objective. You could say that it doesn't represent anything, or you could read into it and try to figure out what these represent. Maybe they're just abstracted forms of down here maybe a bone or an antler type of piece, and maybe up here this is an abstracted eyeball. Possibly, who knows? But what we do know is that the artist has used a contrast in texture here. We have the really smooth, sanded, finished, polished look of the base of the sculpture, and that contrasts with this really kind of decrepit, almost looks scaly texture that we have on this object at the top. And adding that little bit of detail, adding that texture, that unexpected texture, is what really makes this part of the picture pop out. It's what makes this part of the sculpture the thing that you remember after you viewed it, the thing that you linger on, the thing that you're continuing to try to figure out and digest even after you've seen the sculpture. Now, it's always really important in a sculpture when you're using that contrast of texture that you still have a good sense of balance, and balance is something we've already talked about. In this artwork, I want you to think about if the artist had flipped it, if they had made the base out of this really kind of scaly, decrepit texture, and then this object at the top had the really smooth, polished, finished look, it wouldn't be as balanced. It would seem really bottom heavy. There would be a whole lot to look at and a whole lot to think about and a whole lot to digest on the bottom part of the base of the sculpture, and then you'd have just this little bit of a spot of something kind of soft and easy to look at. It would just seem a little unbalanced. So in this particular case, the artist did a great job of balancing the textures, using more of this really smooth, easy to look at, easy to digest texture on the majority of the sculpture, and then using that decrepit, scaly texture on one little part that creates that point of emphasis, and it also helps to balance out the massive base that it has. As I said, if you guys want to go back to the textbook and want to read up on how they define contrast and look at some of the artworks that they give you as an example, feel free. It will certainly help. It's certainly not going to hinder you. It'll only help you. There are tons of resources online as well, but as for any quizzes and any tests and any future assignments that may come up having to do with contrast, I want you guys to remember that contrast is used to make one area of an artwork stand out more than the others, and it's also created for the purposes of this class through contrast in value, contrast in color, and contrast in texture. I'll see you guys with the next podcast.